She was arrested accused of stealing the safe, but when they recovered the footage, the door swung open with a force that didn't match that ordinary Thursday morning. Eleanor didn't even look up right away. She was used to the noise of the office, to people coming and going, to the phone that never stopped ringing, to the printer in the back that always jammed at the worst possible moment. But something about the way that door slammed made her pause mid-motion. It was Gregory, and his face carried something she had never seen once in the 2 years she'd worked there. "The safe is empty." He said it quietly, but in a way that left no room for interpretation. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a warning. It was the beginning of an accusation she couldn't even imagine yet. Elena just stared at him, not understanding. Safe. She knew one existed, of course, in that corner of the office she cleaned on Tuesdays and Thursdays. A black metal object, pushed against the wall beneath the shelves full of folders. But it was just one more object among so many. She had never once looked at it with any real attention. "I don't understand," she said. "You were the only one who came in here before the workday started." And that was how, with that short, definitive sentence, Eleanor's nightmare began. She was 32 years old, her dark hair always pulled back in a tight ponytail, and a whole life built on one single thing: her word. Her family didn't have much, never had. Her mother sewed at home, her younger brother was still in high school, and Eleanor was the name on the account that paid most of the month's bills. The job at that office had come 2 years earlier like a blessing, during a time when she didn't know how she was going to cover the rent. She had shown up wearing the beige uniform shirt as if it were formal attire, because she knew what that job meant. She took her work seriously in a way few people take anything. She arrived before her shift, left every desk spotless, knew where every folder belonged on the shelves, knew the name of everyone who passed through the office. She had never missed a day without calling in. She had never so much as walked off with a single pen, but that Thursday morning, while she was bent over the big table, running the blue cloth carefully from one side to the other, someone was doing something very different on the other side of that same office, and a camera was recording all of it. Only no one knew that yet. Gregory called the whole office together for a meeting that very morning. Elena stood near the door, hands clasped in front of her, feeling the weight of every gaze landing on her. It wasn't a formal accusation yet, but the humiliation didn't wait for formalities. Brandon was sitting at the table in the back, his white shirt immaculately pressed, his hair combed, with that calm air of someone watching a problem that has nothing to do with him. He crossed his arms and slowly shook his head, as if lamenting the situation. A small gesture, discreet, the kind that goes unnoticed when everyone's attention is elsewhere. Eleanor registered that gesture. She filed it away in some corner of her memory, not yet knowing she was going to need it. The meeting was short and heavy. Gregory talked about the amount that had disappeared, about trust, about what it meant for the company, and at the end, he looked directly at Elena. "Until this is cleared up, you're suspended." Suspended. Not fired. Not formally accused in so many words. Suspended. A word that sounds gentler, but in practice means leave, and the guilt goes with you. Elena grabbed her purse, the blue cleaning cloth that was still on the table, and walked to the exit with her head held high. She owed herself that much. She wasn't going to let anyone watch her fall apart in there. Out on the street, the tears came before she even reached the corner. Look, when I got to this part of the story, I had to stop for a second, because there's a very specific dignity in a person who cries, but only after they've left the presence of someone who doesn't deserve to see their pain. That kind of silent strength moves me in a different way. Eleanor's mother, Mrs. Martha, knew the moment her daughter walked through the front door with that look on her face. She was a small woman, with hands calloused from years of sewing, and she knew her daughter better than she knew herself. She didn't ask questions right away. She put water on the stove for tea and waited. When Elena finished telling a partial version of what had happened, omitting the heaviest part, Mrs. Martha stayed silent for a while. "Did you take anything from that place?" "Mum, I'm asking." "No, I would never take anything." Mrs. Martha nodded calmly. It wasn't doubt, it was confirmation of something she already knew. "Then the truth will come out." Elena wanted to believe that with the same serenity as her mother, But the truth, she would discover, sometimes needs a lot of help to come out. Back at the office, Brandon was too calm. That was a detail Mrs. Dorothy had noticed from the start. Mrs. Dorothy was 67 years old and had worked at that company longer than anyone else, longer even than Gregory himself had been in charge. She had been hired by his father decades ago, when the office was still smaller than a living room. She had seen a lot happen in there. She had seen people come in full of energy and leave tired. She had seen business almost go under and recover. She had seen good people and people who pretended to be good. Short, with short-cropped white hair, thick-lensed glasses, and a memory that shamed people decades younger. She took care of the numbers, the contracts, the accounts. She was the kind of person the company couldn't function without, but who most people forgot to thank because she was always simply there doing what needed to be done, without any fuss. And Mrs. Dorothy had a way of observing people that only comes with a lot of lived experience. Brandon was in charge of the cash. He was the one who knew the safe combination. He was the one who controlled the money coming in and going out, so it would be natural for him to be agitated in a situation like this, trying to understand, asking questions, chasing answers. But Brandon was sitting at his desk doing exactly his usual work, as if the answer were already certain, as if he knew precisely where that money had ended up. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Mrs. Dorothy waited until the end of the workday that day, waited for everyone to leave, waited for Brandon to grab his backpack, say goodbye to Gregory with an easy smile, and walk down the stairs like any other afternoon. Then she went to knock on the door of the boss's office. "Gregory, how many years have you known me?" He looked up from the papers. "More than I'd like to admit." "Why?" "Because I'm asking you not to make any final decision about Elena before we review the security camera footage." There was a silence that lasted longer than comfortable. "Do the cameras cover the whole office?" Mrs. Dorothy crossed her arms. That's exactly the right question. She knew about the camera because she herself had suggested installing it 3 years ago, after a laptop had disappeared without explanation. It was a small discrete camera, positioned at an angle that covered the central desk in the office and the corner where the safe was. Gregory had forgotten it existed. Most people forget the things they don't need to use often, but Mrs. Dorothy hadn't forgotten. If Elena took it, the camera will show it. If she didn't, the camera will show that too. In any case, you'll go to sleep knowing you did the right thing. Gregory ran a hand over his face. That camera was installed years ago, Dorothy. The system's been updated since then. I don't know if the file still exists. Then we find out, but we try. She said it with the firmness of someone who's already made the decision on their own and is just waiting for the other person to come around. The IT technician was called the next morning. He was a young guy, quiet, who showed up with a laptop under his arm and settled into the smaller room without making a fuss. The system had been updated months ago, and the file with the previous day's recordings was stored in a format the current software couldn't open directly. It was going to take time. Brandon got to work and spotted the technician right at the entrance. He paused for half a second that most people wouldn't have noticed. Then he kept walking normally. Mrs. Dorothy didn't miss that pause. She was at her desk, pretending to look at spreadsheets, but watching everything out of the corner of her eye. Later that morning, Brandon got up and walked over to where the technician was working with a rehearsed casualness. "Any problem?" "Trying to recover a recording file." "Ah." Brandon nodded slowly. "Sometimes those older systems have glitches. Could be the files corrupted." The technician didn't answer. He kept looking at the screen. Brandon went back to his desk. Mrs. Dorothy mentally noted every word of that short exchange. The seed of doubt planted there, the could be corrupted said before anyone even knew whether it was or wasn't, had the smell of something calculated. At the same time the technician was working to recover the file, Elena was sitting in a waiting room on the other side of town, waiting for a job interview. She'd sent her resume to 3 places the night before, lying in bed at 11 o'clock with dry eyes after hours of her mind racing. The interview went well. The interviewer seemed to like her, asked questions about experience, about availability, about how she handled difficult situations. She answered everything carefully, but at the end, when he asked if he could contact her previous employer as a reference, Eleanor felt the ground give out a few inches beneath her feet. "Sure," she said, because what else could she say? She went home with that weighing on her chest. If Gregory received that call before anything was resolved, the reference would be destroyed. And a destroyed reference in the kind of work she did, in a city where everyone knows each other somehow, was almost impossible to recover from. She had a week, maybe less, before everything collapsed for good. I keep thinking about what it's like to live in that kind of waiting. You know you're innocent. You know it with a certainty that no one on the outside can see. And there's no way to prove it. It's one of the heaviest situations there are, because other people's doubt weighs more than anything concrete. On the third day, the technician managed to access the file. Mrs. Dorothy was in the room when Gregory opened the video on the computer. The recording was from a fixed angle, a little grainy, but clear enough to show what needed to be shown. The video started early in the morning, with the office still empty and light coming in through the windows. The first person to appear was Elena. She walked in with her bag hanging from her shoulder and the blue cleaning cloth in her hand. She set her bag on a chair, took out the cloth, and started wiping down the big table in the center. Head down, focused, moving her arm back and forth carefully, completely absorbed in what she was doing. Then Brandon appeared. Gregory leaned toward the screen. Brandon walked in without making a sound. He was wearing a white shirt and dark pants, exactly like any other morning. He looked at Elena, who had her back to him, running the cloth over the table. He paused for 1 second. Then he turned to the corner where the safe was. He crouched down, spun the dial, opened the door slowly, and began taking out the money, dollar bill by dollar bill. There was something in the way he glanced to the side from time to time, that quick, nervous look checking whether Elena had moved, that made it impossible to look away from the screen. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he had chosen exactly the moment when she was busy to do it. In the footage, Elena kept wiping the table without lifting her head a single time. Brandon closed the safe, straightened up, adjusted his shirt with his hand, and walked out of the room like anyone walks out of anywhere on an ordinary morning. Gregory stared at the screen for a long time after the video ended. Mrs. Dorothy took off her glasses and cleaned the lenses with the corner of her blouse. A small gesture she made when she needed a second to compose what she was feeling. "I needed to see it to believe it," Gregory said, in a voice that was almost a whisper. "I know," Mrs. Dorothy said. "But now you've seen it." The conversation with Brandon happened that same afternoon. Gregory asked him to step into the office and close the door. In the first few minutes, Brandon denied it. He said the footage could be interpreted another way. He said he had gone to the safe to check something routine, that he hadn't taken anything. He said all of it with a confidence that was striking, like someone who had rehearsed that story many times inside his own head, who had slept with it for 3 days, who had made it almost real to himself. Then Gregory turned the computer around and pressed play. The silence after the video ended was different from every other silence of that day. Brandon lowered his head. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out as we're just starting." Now continuing on. What came next wasn't a clean or organized confession. It was a story in pieces, full of long pauses, in which he talked about debts that had piled up over months, about a problem that had started small and grown to the point where he could no longer see a way out. He talked about being too ashamed to ask anyone for help. He talked about a pressure he had carried alone for far too long, until he made a decision he knew was wrong, even while he was making it. And in the end, with his voice low and without looking at anyone, he said, "I didn't want her to be blamed. I thought they simply wouldn't find out where it came from." Mrs. Dorothy, standing outside the half-open door, closed her eyes for a moment. She was 67 years old and had seen a great deal over those years. She had seen good people do bad things because of pressures no one on the outside could see. She had seen people who seemed reliable lose themselves in a moment of despair and not manage to come back before causing real damage. That didn't make what Brandon had done any less serious. Elena had suffered in a way he had caused, and that carried a weight that needed to be acknowledged. But Mrs. Dorothy was old enough to know that almost no story is simple once you get close enough to see the details. Elena received the phone call from Gregory that same afternoon. He was direct. He said the footage had been recovered. He said what it showed. He said he had been wrong to send her away without investigating first, and he apologized for that. He said her job was guaranteed, that he would pay her for the days she had stayed home, and that there were more things he wanted to discuss in person when she came in. She was so quiet that he asked if she was still there. "I am," she said. "I'm just processing." "That's understandable." There was a moment before hanging up when Elena wanted to say so much. She wanted to say what those 3 days had been like. She wanted to talk about the job interview with the reference hanging in the air like a knife. She wanted to talk about her mother, who had noticed that something was very wrong but had respected her daughter's silence. She wanted to say what it feels like to have your own word questioned over something that had never even crossed your mind to do. She said none of that. She just said, "See you tomorrow," and hung up. She sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still warm in her hand. The open window let in the noise of the street below, the sound of kids coming home from school, someone honking in the distance, the usual life going on outside. The truth had appeared, exactly like her mother said it would. But no truth undoes the path you had to walk to get to it. The next day, when Eleanor walked into the office, Mrs. Dorothy was at her desk as always, with her thick-lensed glasses and the stack of papers in front of her. She looked up when Elena came through the door. The two of them had never exchanged more than a good morning. 2 years sharing the same hallway, the same smell of morning coffee, the same sound of the printer jamming, but never actually talking. Mrs. Dorothy stood up, walked over to Elena, and said, "I knew it wasn't you." Elena couldn't keep her chin steady this time. "How did you know?" The older woman took her hand with a calm firmness, no drama. "Because I've watched a lot of people over the course of my life, and I learned to recognize who looks at their work with respect." She paused briefly. "You do." They were simple words, but simple doesn't mean unimportant. Sometimes a sentence said in the right place, by someone who has lived long enough to know what they're seeing, is worth more than any long speech. Later that morning, Megan, a co-worker Eleanor had worked side by side with for months, came to talk to her in the break room. "I should have said something," Megan said without beating around the bush. "I didn't believe you did it, but I stayed quiet. I'm sorry." Eleanor looked at her for a moment, weighed the words she was about to say. "It hurt. Not what you thought about me. The silence hurt." Megan didn't try to justify herself. She didn't explain the fear of getting involved, didn't offer reasons for what she had done. She just nodded, with the weight of someone who understood. And that, somehow, opened the door to something that might one day become a real friendship between them. Do we always manage to speak up when we should? I keep thinking about that. How many times do we stay quiet to avoid trouble, and only later realize that silence has a cost too? And by then, it's too late. Gregory gathered the team at the end of that day. He stood in front of everyone and said in clear words that Elena had been accused by mistake, that the evidence showed exactly the opposite of what had been assumed, and that her name was completely cleared. He said he apologized to her publicly. It wasn't comfortable for him. Elena saw it on his face, the difficulty of admitting out loud that he had been wrong, that he had been too quick to point in the wrong direction. But he did it, and doing it when it's hard carries a different weight than doing it when it's easy. Brandon was no longer there. What would happen between him and Gregory would be resolved in a way Eleanor never learned the details of, and she didn't need to. What she needed was this. Her name said out loud without a stain. That night, she told her mother everything. Everything. No partial version this time. The distance, the accusation, the 3 days of waiting, the interview with the reference hanging in the air, the footage, the phone call. Mrs. Martha listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Elena finished, her mother just looked at her for a while. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I wanted to handle it on my own. You don't handle everything on your own, Elena. I know. No, you don't know yet. You're learning. It was a hard truth. The kind only a mother can say without sounding like criticism, because it comes from a place with no judgment, only love and exhaustion from watching her daughter carry too much weight without asking for help. Elena rested her head on her mother's shoulder, the way she used to when she was a child. Mrs. Martha wrapped her arm around her, and the two of them sat in silence. Out there, her younger brother came in slamming the door as always, tossed his backpack on the floor as always, shouted good night to no one in particular as always. And that tiny little everyday thing that keeps existing while everything falls apart, and then while everything slowly rebuilds, was real life. The one worth protecting. Months later, Eleanor was back to her usual routine. The blue cloth, the tables, the shelves with the colourful folders neatly organised. The same office, but carrying a different weight now. She walked past the corner where the safe was every day, and no longer felt that sharp pain from before. She felt something else, more like the memory of pain, which is different. Mrs. Dorothy had started having coffee with her on the calmer mornings before the rush began. They were short conversations about simple things. Mrs. Dorothy's grandson, who had taken his first steps, the vegetable garden Elena was trying to set up in pots on her apartment balcony. But they were real conversations, the kind that don't need much to talk about to mean a lot. On one of those mornings, with the two of them sitting there holding warm cups of coffee and the sun still low outside, Mrs. Dorothy said something that stayed in Elena's head for a long time afterward. Injustice doesn't disappear because the truth came out, but you learn to carry it differently. Elena thought about those 3 days, about the job interview with that knife hanging over the reference, about her mother with her arm around her on the old sofa, about Megan's silence, which had hurt in a specific way she was still processing, about Mrs. Dorothy's firm voice saying she knew it wasn't her. And she thought about who she had been before it happened, and who she was being now. Not better or worse, different, with a clearer awareness of what her word was worth, that there were people who had believed her even without any proof yet, and that kind of thing isn't small. Sometimes life can't undo what it did, but every now and then it offers enough to keep going, and that's what we do. End of story. Look, this story left me thinking about a lot of things. About Elena, who carried that for 3 whole days with a dignity she had no obligation to have. About Mrs. Dorothy, who after a lifetime of observing the world still wanted to stand up and do something. And about us too, in the moments when we stayed quiet, when we shouldn't have. If this story touched something inside you, leave what you thought in the comments. Do you think Elena did the right thing in not telling her mother everything right away? And where are you watching from? I love reading those messages. A huge hug. Thank you so much for staying until the end, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.